Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Historic New Orleans Collection's Night of Ghoulish and Terrible Tales from New Orleans' True History. My name is Amanda McFillin, and I'm your host this evening, and I'm joined by my colleagues Joanna Robinson, Kurt Owens, Dylan Jordan, and George Schindler. They are going to be presenting you with some of the more macabre tales from New Orleans from the start all the way to the present day. And then afterwards, we're going to have a Q&A with you. We want to hear what you think about it, some of your questions about the videos we're presenting, and your own spooky Halloween experiences as well. Just a few notes. If you are joining us on Zoom here, you're going to see at the bottom there are two buttons, a chat button and a Q&A button. A chat is where you just say hello to all of us, tell us where you're from and some of your favorite spooky moments. The Q&A is where you'll place your questions. So at the end of the session, where you can come back and we'll ask some questions from that section. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, welcome. We want to hear from you as well. We'll be chatting with you in the comments section, and feel free to place your questions there. We'll be looking there as well at the end of the presentations. So here's how it's going to work. I'm going to turn the mic over to my first colleague, Kurt Owens, who's going to be introducing his terrible tale, and we'll be showing you a video. Afterwards, we'll move along to our next guest, and so on and so forth, and watch all of these wonderful videos together. So without further ado, Kurt, I'd like to welcome you here. Just ask you to unmute real quick.
There we go.
Kurt, so good to have you here. And before we get started with the program tonight, before you introduce your video, I'd just like to ask you to tell us a little bit more about the Danse Macabre program that we put together. This originally started out as a tour for HNOC, and I'd like you just to give us a little bit of an overview about what it was previously and why we are going virtual this year.
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Amanda. For several years, we have been leading tours through our Louisiana history galleries, and in the month of October, we told verifiably true, certifiably grim tales of New Orleans. They are things that we all decided upon and worked and researched, and of course, those galleries are a little close for comfort these days, and we decided to go for the virtual videos. And I jumped at the opportunity to tell my story. It seems particularly timely at this moment. So, without any further ado, here is Epidemic.
They called it Bronze John and Saffron Scourge after the pale skin of the victims. And they called it Vomito Negro after one of the more hideous symptoms. The first recorded epidemic in New Orleans was in 1796, taking 600 of the 8,000 residents. The illness was marked by chills, dizziness, headache, high fever, muscle pains, and nausea, followed by a brief recovery. But then a toxic phase could follow that included jaundice and bleeding from gums and ears and nose, delirium, fits, coma, liver and kidney failure, and then at its worst, death. Young, vibrant adults might have been strong, but they were at the greatest risk of the killer. Children would become weak, but recover. The elderly had a very high rate of recovery with immunity, likely due to some previous infection as a child. More men than women were victims. And And in the years 1851 to 1855, up to 10% of the population that didn't flee town died in the plagues that included smallpox and malaria and cholera. Thinking it was some airborne miasma, the city burned smudge pots in the streets, filling the air with thick black smoke. They fired cannons to break up and dispel whatever might be hovering around the city. Medical treatments included bloodletting, blistering, purging, leeching, and consuming 1 cup of mercury a teaspoonful at a time. Now, the smoke might have actually provided some relief. The population was unaware of the reason. According to published reports, corpse carriers began driving wagons through the streets daily, calling for the living to bring out their dead. And during the epidemic of 1853, 30% of the 150,000 residents evacuated the town. Many may have already been unknowingly infected, and their flight possibly spread the disease. They couldn't build cemeteries fast enough. Most of the cemetery workers were afflicted and dead. Churches and relief societies couldn't complete orphanages quickly enough. Tales abounded of corpses stacked like cordwood and then pulled unceremoniously with firemen's hooks into shallow troughs and covered with soil. That year, 1853, the August 11th edition of the New Orleans Daily Crescent reported a scene from one of the cemeteries. At the gates, the winds brought intimation of the corruption lurking within, the rank atmosphere from rotting corpses. Inside there were caskets piled by the 50s, exposed in the heat of the sun, swollen with corruption, bursting their coffin lids to present a feast of horrors. Inside, corpses piled in pyramids. And outside the gates, old and withered crones and fat huckster women dispense ice creams and confections and brush away the green bottle flies that hovered on their merchandise and then buzzed away to drink from the green and festering corpses. Various reports placed the number of dead from the epidemic of 1853 at between 7,000 and 12,000. Many of the cemeteries that are now tourist attractions are crammed with the victims of the plagues. In 1867, Reverend Peter Leonard Davis promised a shrine to St. Roch, a saint frequently invoked against epidemics. To St. Roch, if all of his parishioners were kept safe from the fever. None were reported to have died, and the shrine was completed in 1876. But then, during the 1898 Spanish-American War, more U.S. soldiers died of the fevers than from combat. And the U.S. Military Medical Commission was convened to find out why. And in June of 1900, U.S. Army surgeon Major Walter Reed identified the mysterious killer. It was a virus spread by a mosquito, the Aedes aegypti, bearing contagion from human to human to human. And New Orleans, with its above-ground sewage gutters and uncovered cisterns, filthy streets, surrounding swamps and stagnant runoff ponds, was a perfect breeding ground for the mosquito. And so, armed with this information and with improved sanitation, the last epidemic was in New Orleans in 1905 of the mysterious killer that we now know as yellow fever.
My, that was funny. Well, for those of you who are still around after that, I'd like to introduce my co-worker, Joanna Robinson, with her story. Joanna?
Hi, everyone. My name's Joanna, and in this video, we're going to go back just over 100 years ago to the city's jazz age, to a time when, oddly enough, that we were also in the middle of another global pandemic. But at this time, disease was not the only killer stalking the streets of New Orleans. March 19th, 1919. At first glance, it is a typical late evening in New Orleans. But on this night, hardly a single person can be found walking the streets. Front porches are vacant, the air unnervingly still. The silence, only occasionally punctuated by the sound of a jazz band wafting through the distance. Tonight is the culmination of a year of terror that has gripped the city. The culprit is New Orleans' most infamous serial killer. Although theories of his identity and motives abound, he was never caught. And even today, he is best known by the same name he was back then, the Axeman. Let's back up, shall we? By the late 19-teens, New Orleans' jazz music scene was in full swing. At the same time, the city was probably the most diverse place in the South, with a population that included many Sicilian immigrants. Initially, however, these newcomers were greeted with prejudice and suspicion, and what happened beginning in 1918 would shake the community to the core. On May 23, 1918, Joseph and Catherine Maggio, immigrant grocers, were found brutally murdered in their home on Upper Line Street, attacked with their own axe, their throats slit. Thus began a series of crimes that would drag on for 18 months. The crimes had several elements in common, pointing to the work of a single deranged individual. The killer would enter the homes by cutting a panel in the back door, and, as in the case of the Maggios, attack the victims with their own axe. Most purported victims were Italian Americans, and several were also grocers. Fueled by sensational media reports, the city entered a panic. Some people got rid of their axes, and men stood watch over their sleeping families, lest they be caught off guard. As panic escalated and rumors swirled regarding the identity of the killer, the Times-Picayune newspaper received what had to be its most outlandish letter to the editor ever published, claiming to be from the Axeman himself.
Hell, March 13th, 1919. Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, be smeared with the blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company.
He goes on like this at length, claiming, among other things, to be in a league with the Angel of Death, before making an oddly specific threat.
I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music. And I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it on Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that has ever existed, either in fact or realm of fancy, the Axeman.
No crime occurred on the night of March 19th, 1919, but plenty of New Orleanians did jazz it, just in case. The identity of the letter writer remains as mysterious as that of the murderer. Whether it was penned by a cold-blooded killer or an out-of-work musician also remains in question. The last murder credibly tied to the Axeman occurred several months later, with the late October slaying of another Italian grocer, Mike Pepitone. After that, the Axeman vanished into the mists of history, or perhaps the fires of hell. All right, guys. Well, without further ado, I will turn it over to Captain George Schindler to introduce his video.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming here tonight. Joanna, fantastic. My piece is on battlefield medicine and the often grotesque realities of life before antiseptics, antibiotics, all those things that we sort of take for granted. So without further ado, battlefield butchery. Well, in a moment, I'm sure. I'd like to point out to everybody this very interesting computer I found here in the old ice house. We have all kind of fun stuff lying around at the Historic New Orleans collection, don't we? But I'm glad to be. I'm glad to be here and doing this from Dr. Morgis's lab here. So.
Good evening. Battlefield medicine was in its infancy in 1814 when Great Britain dispatched an invasion force of over 14,000 soldiers and sailors with the objective of seizing New Orleans. The War of 1812 was coming to a close, but Great Britain had her eyes on one of the richest prizes in all of North America. That the city was largely unfortified and poorly defended further tantalized His Majesty's military strategists. Though a peace had been agreed to in late December, the Treaty of Ghent would have no effect until March of 1815. This situation suited General Edward Pakenham, commander of the invasion forces. All that separated himself and his officer corps from the Paris of the Caribbean was a militia force and a commander who lacked experience fighting against the professional European army. General Andrew Jackson would not be able to withstand this show of force. So confident were the British officers that many took their wives along with them so that they too could enjoy the pleasures promised by an occupied New Orleans. Unfortunately for Pakenham, he underestimated Jackson, South Louisiana's inhospitable terrain, the citizens of the city, and the Baratarian corsair Jean Lafitte. His privateers and their expert use of artillery turned what should have been an easily achieved objective into a bloodbath. The Battle of New Orleans began on January 8, 1815, and ended in under an hour. In that time, American musket and Baratarian cannon fire killed or wounded nearly 2,100 British, while the American forces suffered only a few dozen casualties. Advances in battlefield medicine during the recent Napoleonic Wars made treating the wounded much more efficient. That's not to say that battlefield surgeons had an easy job. The relatively primitive weaponry of the time did not leave clean, even wounds. The model 1795 Springfield musket fired a 69 caliber soft lead ball at relatively low speeds. A projectile fired from such a weapon would do considerable damage to sinew, muscle, and bone. Add 9-pound cannonballs and grape shot being expertly and efficiently fired into tight lines of soldiers, and the difficulties of practicing medicine at the time become clearer. Most of these wounds were not necessarily fatal on their own, but without expedient treatment, a wounded soldier would very likely succumb to injuries or infection. Often, there is only one course of action: amputation. To perform battlefield amputation, one must first hope that we have 2 inches of healthy tissue between a socket joint and the affected area. Any less, and a tourniquet cannot properly be applied, leading to more bleeding and greater chance of death for the patient. After the tourniquet is applied, an incision is made through the tissue down to the bone in a circular fashion, leaving some extra skin hanging off for later. A leather strop is then used to peel back the flesh and expose the bone. A saw is placed upon it, and with 1 or 2 deft motions, the limb will be liberated from the corpus. Then, using either horsehair or cotton thread, arteries are sutured off. You will know which blood vessels to suture. After that's done, the bone is filed down so that it would be smooth, and the excess skin is folded over and sutured, leaving space for the wound to drain. Et voila, 1 down, 1999 to go. Barbaric, no? Though these measures may seem extreme to us, the procedure is actually quite effective and often quite necessary. Most soldiers to undergo these treatments would survive, though they would be changed. For those whom the doctor did not arrive on time, they were buried on the field of battle. But deceased British officers, including poor General Pakenham, were to be sent back to England for burial so that they may repose in England's green and pleasant land. But a month-long sea journey is not ideal for a dead body. The Royal Navy, however, had plans for that as well. The dead body would be eviscerated, folded up, and sealed in a rum cask for the duration of the journey. Happy Halloween.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that or something similar to it. The pièce de résistance for this evening, we have Dylan Jordan, his final contribution to our Halloween Dance of Dance of Death, La Danse Macabre. Dylan, take it.
Thank you, George. So this next and final tale is about the revolt against Spanish rule in 1768, when local French colonists briefly overthrew the Spanish regime, and a ghost story connected to it about a local priest at the time. And this is the world premiere.
In 1762, near the end of the 7 Years' War, France ceded Louisiana to its Bourbon ally, Spain. The following year, the Treaty of Paris partitioned Louisiana between the victorious English and Spain. The English took possession of land east of the Mississippi River, while Spain retained dominion over New Orleans and all land west of the river. When French colonists in New Orleans learned that they were now subjects of the Spanish crown, a period of uncertainty and political crisis commenced. In 1766, the first Spanish governor, Antonio de Ulloa, arrived in New Orleans. He arrived with few troops and little pomp or circumstance. Further, he kept delaying a ceremony of the formal transfer of power. His political position, therefore, appeared weak and tenuous. Spain was principally interested in Louisiana as an imperial border colony to protect against British incursions into Spanish Mexico. As Ulloa began promulgating new commercial and defense policies. An alliance was forged between the colonial elite in New Orleans, who ran the Superior Council, the acting governing body of the colony, and rural farmers along the German coast, upriver from the city, as well as newly arrived Acadian migrants. Urban merchants, planters, and small-scale farmers alike feared that new trade restrictions would decimate the Louisiana economy, which depended upon trade networks across the Atlantic world that defied imperial boundaries. As political tensions and economic uncertainty escalated, a plot emerged amongst members of the Superior Council to oust Ulloa. In October of 1768, Ulloa announced new stringent Spanish trade policies, which would forbid trade with non-Spanish ports. The proclamation created a pretext to set the plot in motion. Conspirators in New Orleans began recruiting militias in the countryside and circulating a petition of grievances against Ulloa, tapping into mutual feelings of anger, resentment, and economic anxieties. The formal proceedings of the Superior Council were timed with the arrival of rural militias in New Orleans. On the morning of October 29th, 1768, a crowd of hundreds gathered in the Place d'Armes to witness the official delivery of the petition to the Superior Council. Ulloa himself was not present, having already fled aboard a Spanish ship the night before. After reading the list of grievances, the Superior Council voted to expel Ulloa, leaving him 3 days to leave the colony. In short order, Ulloa embarked for Havana, and the bloodless coup appeared to have been a success. The Superior Council dispatched an emissary to France in hopes of convincing the Crown to retake Louisiana. France, however, had little interest in doing so, and instead supported the Spanish efforts to suppress the rebellion. A few months following Ulloa's expulsion, the Spanish appointed a new governor, Alejandro O'Reilly. In the summer of 1769, he left Havana with a flotilla of 23 ships and nearly 2,000 soldiers. He raised the Spanish flag at New Orleans and arrested the principal leaders of the rebellion. 21 men were banished from the colony. 5 were imprisoned in Cuba, and following a nearly 2-month tribunal, 6 men were sentenced to death. One, Joseph Villery, died before the sentence could be carried out. The others, Nicolas Chauvin Lafreniere, Jean-Baptiste Noyen, Pierre Caresse, Pierre Marquis, and Joseph Millet, were executed by firing squad at Fort St. Charles on the edge of town, at the foot of present-day Esplanade Avenue and Frenchmen Street. While O'Reilly's actions were not particularly excessive in light of the circumstances, local history has supplied him with the moniker Bloody O'Reilly. Memory of the revolt of 1768 is preserved in a popular ghost story, one of the oldest ghost stories in the city. Père Dagobert, a Capuchin friar who came to New Orleans from Quebec, served as the priest of St. Louis Church at the time of the revolt. According to legend, O'Reilly, being so cruel and so bloody, forbade the men Catholic burial rites. Their families, crushed by this final humiliation, asked Father Dagobert to petition the Spanish officials on their behalf. Failing to persuade them, however, he took matters into his own hands. One rainy night, he beckoned the bereaved families to his quarters. There reposed the corpses of the 5 men. How had the priests conveyed the bodies from the killing ground to the church? The families joined Dagobert in a procession to the St. Peter Street Cemetery, the original cemetery of the city, at the corner of St. Peter and Burgundy Streets. Along the way, they chanted Kyrie eleison and sang funeral hymns before interring the bodies in the cemetery. Père Dagobert continued to serve as the priest of St. Louis Church until his death in 1776. But on certain rainy nights, in the pre-dawn dark along the alleyways of St. Louis Cathedral, one may still catch a scrap of song in the sandaled footsteps of the Friar Dagobert as he traces the former steps of his miraculous procession for the heroes of 1768.
All right. Thank you all for those chilling tales. They were wonderful. We have some questions here from the audience I'd love to get into. And just a reminder to everyone watching, if you have any questions about the tales you heard tonight or other New Orleans stories you want to pick our brain, we are here. You can post your questions here in the Q&A or on Facebook. Just put it in a comment and we'll get into them. So let's start. We have let's see. Oh, this is a good one. Were there any stories from the Danse Macabre tour that you did not get to include in videos this year that you'd like to share? We mentioned earlier, Kurt talked about how this was originally a much longer tour that we offered in person in our galleries, and there were more stories that we told there. So I'll open the floor up to y'all. If any of y'all want to share some of the other stories that we would normally have put on the tour.
Well, I don't enjoy, but I like telling the story of the trunk murders on Ursuline Avenue in 1929, I believe. Oh, it's just full of all the frightfulness and gore. Essentially, a woman was going to leave her husband. She and her sister married a set of brothers, which is just a weird circumstance. It doesn't really factor in too much. But long story short, his wife is threatening to leave her husband. He doesn't like that. He goes out drinking all day, yada, yada, yada. He chops her up with a cane knife, which is similar to a machete, but smaller, a little lighter, but sharper. And then he kills her and her sister, and she hacks them up and puts them in the trunks. The trunks aren't found until the next day by a maid who is screaming literal bloody murder. And the neighbors come in, they call the newspaper. It actually takes about an hour for anyone to think to call the coroner to come and take a look at this. The coroner's office actually described the state of the body, or they listed the cause of death as shock due to decapitation of the head, which, that'll do it.
Yes.
But that's it. That's a good spine-tingling one that's old enough to not be touching on anyone living's actual grief. Anyone else?
Yes, absolutely. Anyone else?
I'll tell you. One of my favorite stories was about the Girard Street Cemetery that was notoriously reviewed in Life magazine in the 50s as this derelict, decrepit, crumbling, ruined cemetery from the early 19th century. The cemetery had begun as a response to the Protestant section of St. Louis being filled, and the Archdiocese of the Episcopal Church here in New Orleans was authorized to start a new cemetery. However, it was in a pretty undesirable part of the town, frequently wet, frequently flooded, and by the early 50s, Life magazine showed photographs from the cemetery showing caskets pulled from the vaults, opened and searched for valuables, leaving the corpses just laying in the open. Photographs show people stepping over caskets and coffins in the cemetery. Ultimately, the cemetery was closed. The Archdiocese insisted that people send their relatives to a new cemetery that was being prepared. And little by little, it was emptied. But worse than that, though, there were several pieces that were removed. People's patios had suddenly pieces of marble from various mausoleums in their yards. And as it was bulldozed and bricks moved for other places, they would move the dirt for landfills. And one story I had heard was that a woman in Metairie was watching landfill in her part of town preparing a new house, and she stood at her back door and thought to herself, sure a lot of sticks in that dirt. The story was that the New Orleans Superdome was built on the Girard Street Cemetery, and for decades, the Saints would not win as long as it was on this plot of sacred ground. The truth is, only a portion of one of the parking garages is over the former Girard Street Cemetery. So parking might be an issue, but not the Saints.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Kurt. Thank you. What a great story. This question I see here, I think is for Joanna. Lori asked, are there any theories about the identity of the Axeman? Do we know who he or she actually was?
Well, first of all, I like that you said or she. All of the victims did report a man, kind of heavy set, dark hair, no beard. That was creative license. Yeah, so the most common theory that you hear is a guy named Joseph Mumfree or Monfrey. You see it spelled both ways. And although there are reasons to kind of doubt this, I'll just tell you the story. The last murder that is commonly tied to the Axeman, which I briefly mentioned in the film, the guy's name was Mike Pepitone, sometimes spelled Pipitone. A lot of the Italian surnames, newspapers weren't very fastidious about the spellings, so you'll get all kinds of different spellings. But his widow moves to Los Angeles, and several years later, she shoots dead a guy named Joseph Monfrey. And as the story goes, she said that she killed him because he killed her second husband. And then later she says that he was the same guy who killed her first husband. And for some people, that's enough to say that, yes, Joseph Monfrey was the Axeman. And he had been in and out of jail in New Orleans and Louisiana over the previous decade or so. He had been involved in Black Hand activity. Black Hand is often like what you might in like common parlance call mafia activity, although it wasn't really mafia. Black Hand's basically an extortion technique that was practiced by certain criminal gangs who tended to be from Sicily. And so that kind of gives him that criminal past, those criminal ties. Some of the people who doubt that theory would say, these crimes really didn't have the markers of, or at least most of them did not have the markers of Black Hand activity. And then some people would say, actually, that a lot of these crimes that are supposedly Axeman crimes may have not been Axeman crimes. There was a lot of media hysteria, like I mentioned. So it's possible that there's not just one person responsible for all of them. And ultimately, we'll never know.
We will never know. It'll remain a mystery. Thank you, Joanna. I think, let's see. I'm going to ask another question that we have here from Cecilia. She wants to know when and why the mortuary chapel was built. Now tell everyone where the mortuary chapel is and then a little bit about it. Dylan, do you want to kick us off, or Kurt?
Yeah, sure, I can. So the mortuary chapel was built in, I think, 1826, when mainly because of these epidemics of yellow fever and other diseases, where so they banned funerals in St. Louis Cathedral to prevent spread of the disease and so forth. And they built this mortuary chapel very close to St. Louis Cemetery number 1 in 1826. And so it's on Rampart Street, I think Rampart in St. Louis, or maybe Rampart in Toulouse, but it's Our Lady of Guadalupe Church today. And interestingly, inside that church, there's a shrine to Saint Expedite, which is an interesting apocryphal saint. who's like the saint of procrastinators, and but it's like based on this myth of a box arrived at the church, and there's like a story of this in other countries too, where it said expedite, like ship it quickly, you know, but it became Saint Expedite, Saint of Expediters. But yeah, so the mortuary chapel was is still there on Rampart Street, and it was used to to try to prevent spread of these diseases.
That's great. Thank you, Dylan. A follow-up question actually for Joanna. Diana is asking, what is the likelihood that the Axeman was acting out of bigotry against Italians? Was there any talk about that?
Well, it's definitely been brought up, and one of the pieces of evidence, so to speak, for that is that the Axeman's letter, like George, I think, actually mentioned in the chat function, the night mentioned in the letter supposedly from the Axeman is March 19th, which is also St. Joseph's Day, which is a very important holiday for Sicilian Americans. Now, that and the fact that a majority of these victims tied to the Axeman were Italian American and also grocers. So the letter itself, most people do not seriously think that it was written by the same person who was committing these crimes. Was most likely a hoax, kind of honestly a cruel joke. And the person who wrote the letter probably had a little bit of, prejudice they were showing against Italian Americans. Interestingly enough, and I know I'm getting a little bit off of the original question, that letter bore some similarities to some supposed letters from Jack the Ripper in England. There were a bunch of letters written to newspapers there, one of which was also dated from hell. So this person who wrote this letter was probably very literate. The way they write, this person was well educated and would not fit the profile of the Axeman. Most criminal historians say it was probably a working class individual. And yes, there may have been some motivation. A lot of serial killers, and I say that phrase, which was actually, I don't think, coined until the 1970s. So the idea back in the 19-teens of a person just killing with no motivation, or no the motivation's the wrong word, just killing people they didn't know, killing people without a rational motive over and over again. That's something that's really embedded in our psyche, but that was completely foreign to these people. But yeah, a lot of serial killers will target very specific groups. So maybe, it's I read a suggestion that maybe he had some run-in with an Italian grocer at some point, and that was who he targeted. He seemed to be targeting the men, some people would say, and then the women, and in one case a child who was killed were collateral. He attacked sleeping victims, and there were, like I said in the film, there were a lot of similarities. The chiseled door panel, there's often an appearance of burglary where he'd take one or two things but really leave the actual valuables untouched. So yeah, and that's another reason why and I would most closely align myself with this theory. It was a serial killer type person whose motives probably not very rational, but may have been fueled by prejudice. Long answer, sorry.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much, Joanna, for all that extra information. That was wonderful. Kurt, we have a question for you. Mary Beth wants to know, when was the term yellow fever first used?
I'm not really sure exactly, but it was certainly a very descriptive name early on because the victims turned yellow with jaundice. And so if you had turned yellow and some of the other more horrible features, then they would call that yellow fever. Also the other names, because they were pretty florid in their language.
Absolutely. Yeah, there were some pretty gruesome names. This one here, I think I'll let all of y'all, and maybe if you all want to answer, take turns answering. Lori's asking, do you have any books you would recommend to learn more about New Orleans' macabre history?
There's a lot of information, especially on the Axeman, but on a lot of stuff we talked about in a book called Empire of Sin. Absolutely fantastic book. And it's got there's really not a lot on the Axeman specifically. I don't mean to speak over Joanna on that. But Empire of Sin has, I think, the most robust and the most accurate information on that particularly difficult thing to study. I know that when I was doing research on the trunk murders, I found out that a lot of the police records from that time and before, that's late 20s, are gone. And even the library, the microfilm is deteriorating. So especially for the Axeman, that early 20th century period, we just don't have a lot of information that survives. But Empire of Sin has a lot of that. And it's also just a very, very good book about all kinds of fun things in New Orleans history.
I would second Empire of Sin, George. And there's another book that I also referenced. Actually, I have it right here. It is within reach. It's called The Axeman of New Orleans by Miriam Davis. It is also pretty thoroughly researched. And it reads, almost in like a narrative style. It's nonfiction, but it's very engaging read as well.
It seems to me that there was a book of New Orleans ghost stories, and it may have been called New Orleans Ghost Stories, that were assembled in the early part of the 20th century. Perhaps Lyle Saxon. He certainly collected a lot of stories about New Orleans, some of them verifiable, some of them hysterical. And I know that we did pull from those, or at least referred to them as we were preparing several years ago on Danse Macabre.
Kurt, is that Ghost Stories of Old New Orleans?
I think it might be, yes.
It had like the woodblock prints. I think that's what it's called. Yeah, those beautiful illustrations.
And there's a lot of stories in there. I think their purpose was to thrill and chill rather than actually report history.
Fair enough. Dylan, do you have any book recommendations you'd like to contribute?
Yeah, sure. I think the book that they were just talking about is called Ghost Stories of Old New Orleans by Jean Delavigne. And it's, I forget what year, but I think pretty early in the 20th century. It's written in a very poetically, I guess you could say, more kind of literary than like historical. I mean, but so for it's really good source material for these like many like largely forgotten tales that I think used to sort of like imbue the character of the city back then.
That's great. Maybe I can ask you all as we kind of go through these last few questions, if you have a moment, post the title and the author, if you don't mind, of some of these books you've recommended in the chat for the attendees. I think they would really appreciate that. Let's see. We have another question, and Dylan, I think this one's for you. One of our attendees is asking, where is St. Peter's Cemetery now, and what's there now? So this is, I think, one of the cemeteries that had been relocated.
Yeah, so the St. Peter Street Cemetery is sort of like the original cemetery in the city that was used during the French colonial period. And I think that it was sort of discovered or rediscovered in the 1970s when the property owner was like digging a swimming pool or something like that. So there was this archaeological excavation, and they found remains of interred bodies of people of European and African descent buried underground. And so, yeah, it was at around St. Peter and Burgundy Street, sort of like on the edge of the town.
All right, thank you. And so it looks like we are coming up on the end of our time here, but we have one last question. If somebody is asking, what is the image at the beginning of all the videos? Is it a person on a fish? And I'm repeating that question because as we close out, I will go ahead and share that image again so you can all get a good look about it. But if any of y'all know a little bit more information about that image, I know it's from our collections. It's a wonderful image. Anything to add?
No, I can't remember the artist now. But it is Death riding a fish.
Death riding a fish. Here you go. You can see it here. And we've used it, I think, for a few years now as the kind of title image for the Danse Macabre tour.
Yeah, so 1974, by a local artist named Ben Smith. Yeah, Death Riding a Redfish.
Death riding a redfish. Thank you so much, Dylan. And thank all of y'all. This was a wonderful evening. I think, let's see, do we have one last question here? Somebody's asking, where might I find a copy of Empire of Sin? I believe you can find it online, but you can also probably find it at our HNOC gift shop as well, where you can order it online and have it delivered to you. So just to give them a quick plug. So please check that out as well. So hold on a second, I'm sorry. There we go, closing out. All right, well, thank you all again to my colleagues here. That was amazing. Do y'all have any final thoughts for the evening?
Happy Halloween, everybody.
Yes. Happy Halloween. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you virtually soon. Thank you.